Oh, welcome to Syntax. On this Monday Hasty Treat, we're going to be talking all about open source. What is open source? What are the different types of licenses that you should know about? And maybe what should you use on your project? My name is Scott Tolinsky. I'm a developer from Denver, and with me, as always, is CJ. What's up, CJ?
Hello. Not much. Doing good. I'm loving this spring weather here in Denver.
Yeah, me too. I've been doing some major yard work. We have some periwinkle out front, which apparently periwinkle invasive. Did not know that. And I was seeing like it growing. I was like, this is so beautiful, the purple flowers. But from what I read, it can choke out everything else in your little landscaping. So you got to keep it under control. So I was just like ripping out periwinkle yesterday. I wanted to keep some of it, but I want to keep it under control.
Definitely.
Yeah. And let's talk about open source. But before we do, let's talk about Sentry. This podcast is brought to you by Sentry, and Sentry is huge into open source. Sentry is open source. You can read more about that at open.sentry.io. In fact, you can check out the Sentry codebase for yourself. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what makes Sentry's open source license interesting later on in this episode. But not only is Sentry open source, Sentry gave $500,000 to open source maintainers last year, which they kind of do, maybe not to that amount, but they do a large sponsorship of open source projects every year. And in fact, one of the cool things that they do even for Syntax is they scan our repo and then they donate to all the projects that we use in the Syntax code base. So how cool is that? It's like actually giving back to the projects that we actually get to take advantage of. So shout out to Sentry for doing some really cool open source work. It's a really, really awesome thing they do. So CJ, let's get into it first and foremost. When people hear open source, I'm sure some people know exactly what that refers to, and other people who might be newer just hear the word and just goes over. They don't even think about it. So What is open source and what makes a project open source?
Definitely. And I've seen that misconception a lot, in that people hear open source and they think, oh, just that means it's free. Like, especially working with like non-technical people, they're like, oh, it's open source, must mean it's just free. It's free software. But I'm going to read you and the listeners the definition from Wikipedia and then kind of like dive into what it's talking about there. So on Wikipedia, it says open source software, or OSS, is computer software that is released under a license in which the copyright holder grants the users the right to use, study, change, and distribute the software and its source code to anyone and for any purpose. And so the key point here is that the software has a specific license applied to it, and that license is an open source license. The common thing that you'll hear people talk about is open source is like free as in free speech, not free as in free beer. Not like you're getting something for free, but you're getting like the ideas are free in a way. I don't know if that's the best analogy.
Hey, no, that's good. I think that makes sense. Everybody likes a free beer, but that's not what this is, right?
No, yeah. And I think another disclaimer before we talk about all this stuff, we are not lawyers. Like, this deals with copyright law, and this isn't legal advice. So if you're worrying about this stuff for like a company or your project, you should definitely seek legitimate legal advice. We're just going to tell you what we know as developers. So
yeah, totally. And definitely it could be seen as from either a hobbyist perspective, just straight up developer's perspective. But again, yeah, if you're going to be basing your entire company's open source policy off this episode, maybe not the best call.
Yeah. And so with that idea, this idea of source available is not necessarily open source. So like you can go on GitHub and you can see millions and millions of projects and actually look at their source code. On a surface, like, that is source available, but specifically looking at the license itself is going to tell us what we can actually do with that source code. A really good website to learn about this stuff is choosealicense.com. And they have a breakdown of if you're deciding to choose an open source license for your project, what do you care about? And they talk about that and tell you which licenses you should choose. But at the bottom of the site, they have this section that talks about what happens if you don't choose a license. And so if you ever come across a GitHub repo that doesn't have a license applied to it, technically, and I guess according to US copyright law, if there is no license applied to it, it actually is under an exclusive copyright by default. So the website choosealicense.com talks about the scenario where you come across code that doesn't have a license on it. And if you're a user and you come across this repo, it actually means that you technically don't have permission from the creators to use that software, modify it, or share it.
Lack of permission is not permission, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and it does get a little more technical because there is a terms of service on the GitHub website, and they do say things like, well, if you're putting your code here, then you're allowing people to fork it. So it gets a little more complex than that. But all of this to say, you should probably choose a license. If you're going to be putting code on GitHub, you should choose a license, and we're going to talk about that here.
Yeah, and I think to some regard too, if you are not sure what the future of your code looks like, you're probably going to want to pick a less permissive license, just because you can always open it more. But when you try to close down software, I believe it's only closed down from that point forward. As in, if I go from a fully open source code base that's open sourced in, for total free use in 2020, if I lock it down in 2022, that code from 2020 to 2022 is available, right? That is under the original license.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. So that's why I think it's a great point that if you plan on building a business with your software, like if you want to try to make some money from it, that's definitely when you need to start to think about the different types of licenses, and potentially not even, I guess it depends on your business and what you're trying to do, but you might not even publish it to GitHub until you're really ready and until you've really added a license on it and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And one of these licenses that we'll get into a little bit down the line is something that Sentry uses, because they're a business. They run on open source software, but you can't just steal Sentry's code base. So we'll talk all about what that means.
Definitely. And with that in mind, so earlier in the episode, Scott mentioned open.sentry.io. It actually is a great entry into learning about open source as well, because they talk about how Sentry, a very successful and awesome product and business, how they can be open source and still be profitable. And so they talk about the licenses that they use, and specifically there's a section on benefits. So I think I'll just talk about really quick some of the things that I like about open source and some of the reasons why I apply the MIT license to all of my code repos. So aside from syntax, I also have a channel called Coding Garden, and every single project I've ever created for Coding Garden, every example code, everything I have released under the MIT license. And so we'll talk about types of licenses next, but the MIT license is a very open license, and this is one of the benefits listed on this Sentry site about open source is for educational purposes. And so the reason I liked to release my software under an open source license is I want to educate people. I want to show examples. I want people to be inspired by the things that I've done. And so for me, that's a really big benefit, is being able to teach through source code. And so that's one benefit of open source as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Another one that I guess it can be a double-edged sword, but this idea of being more secure. So lately, you've probably seen in the news a lot of stuff about software vulnerabilities and exploits and things going wrong that basically put businesses and people at risk. But with software that is open source, it can have a lot of different eyes on it. And so with a lot of different eyes on it, you have potentially very smart people, very technical people that can go in and audit that source code and find bugs or find vulnerabilities and fix them. And so this is one of the things that Sentry benefits from as well, is the source is open, so anybody can go in and look. And if they find a bug, Sentry also has a bug bounty program. So if you're out there and you're looking at the source and you actually find something that could have caused a vulnerability issue or something like that, Sentry will actually pay you for that. And so that's another really cool thing about open source, is it creates more secure code. I don't know, Scott, if you've looked at this page, open.sentry.io, are there any of the benefits that kind of like you identify with in your code?
Yeah, I think a lot of the ones that you've already talked about, given the fact that I've done so much education, that I like to keep my repos in general kind of open. And also MIT, like when you're first getting into open stuff in general, open source, you do just kind of say, just throw MIT on it and call it a day, because, a lot of the stuff I'm doing specifically is to give people that feel. But the Community-oriented stuff is always good. My community-oriented vibes with my open source software is different because it's more educational based. Like, I want people to look at this stuff, but also, again, improve the code if they see something that could be a better example, or perhaps the code could be written in a different way, or even just commented on. I host a number of open source projects, like my habit tracker is open source that I run, habitpath.io. And one of the cool things that happens there is the community has looked at various parts of the UI and improved the UI, given better error messages on login screens and things like that, just because they're using the software. Hey, I'm a member of this software, I'm using it. If I don't like how this is outputting this error message, I can just go in there and make it a little bit better, add a little if statement there, or pop in a nice little error message. And granted, that's a very optimistic view of how community-driven open source works. But at a small scale, a handful of people using this stuff, it can be really just a nice experience. Now, granted, when you get into code bases like Vite or something, it could be a nightmare of contributions and people wanting to mess up things or change things or have their opinions or be angry or mad. But I do like the community aspect of it.
Definitely. And I think for people that are wanting to get into open source for whatever reason, like wanting to become an open source contributor, that's typically where it starts. Is you're using some piece of software and then you come across a bug or a feature that you would like, and you just work on it. So I did this when I was using and learning about Coolify. So there were some like bugs in the UI that I came across, and I was like, might as well, I'm using it, might as well try and fix it. So that got me to pull the repo down, make a PR, and I think I had like 4 different PRs that got merged into Coolify just because I was using it and I found some ways to improve it.
Yeah, that was pretty neat of you, by the way.
Yeah, of course.
So let's talk about the different types of licenses. You might notice that anytime you create a new project on GitHub, if you're in the UI at least, if you click new, a new repository, you enter your repository, perhaps there's a little checkbox that says add a git ignore or add a readme. Well, you might notice that there's also choose a license. And from here, this is the easiest possible way to choose a license that might suit your project, because it's just going to initialize your project with that license. And if you know what you want or what type of license you might want, if you just want to throw MIT on there, it's super easy to one-click MIT, and then your repo will then have that license. So let's start off talking about the different types of licenses. And the first ones we're going to be getting into are the permissive types of licenses. And permissive in this context means you can do more with this code. They're less locked down.
Yeah. And the first one and probably most popular is the MIT license. And it's very simple and readable. And honestly, I'm just going to read the first clause in it because you've probably seen this before. So it says, permission is hereby granted free of charge to any person obtaining a copy of this software and associated documentation files to deal in the software without restriction, including without limitation, the rights to use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, and or sell copies of the software, and to permit persons to whom the software is furnished to do so, subject to the following conditions. But basically, when you put this license on your software, you are saying anyone is allowed to take my source code and do anything they want with it. They could take that source code and then close source it. They could make it so that any changes they make, no one gets to see. They could take that open source repo and literally just start a business off of it. Like, they could create commercial software. They don't even have to modify the source code. They could literally take that repo, decide to host it somewhere, and start making money off of it. With that also is the last clause here that basically prevents the creator of the software from being liable for anything. So let's say you had some software that you didn't put the MIT license on, but maybe you did allow people to use your source code. If they started a business with that software and then something went wrong, maybe somebody got hurt or maybe it lost them money or something like that. If you didn't have this little clause here on the MIT license that says, like, I have no liability for what you do with my software, then you potentially would be liable. You could get into some legal trouble there. So that's another reason you would apply this license to your software, is because if somebody decides to go use it and maybe a way you didn't intend or something goes wrong, this license basically says that you're not liable for what happened there.
Yeah.
And the MIT license is fairly straightforward. It's like just 3 tiny little paragraphs, and it's permissive in that way. It says, do whatever you want, but if something goes wrong, I'm not liable.
Yeah, I think there is a common misconception that all of these licenses are very difficult to read. But even the FSL license, which we'll talk about, is all very readable if you get into it. But yeah, MIT, I think one of the reasons why it really blew up with GitHub itself is simply because it is so easy to parse, easy to read, nice and simple.
Definitely. And another one that falls under permissive is the Apache license. And a lot of companies like the Apache license more because it basically has more, it's a bit longer and more verbose than the MIT license, and it has more wording around liability and trademark use. And so if you look at the Apache license 2.0, it's a little bit longer, still very readable.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons people might choose this instead is they still want their software to be open to people, but they want to make sure they have certain limitations in terms of liability and like trademark use and a few other things like that.
But again, you could fork and use for commercial reasons. I think this is this little green, blue, red thing that this website has going on, the Choose My License, is really pretty neat and a great way to visualize this stuff if you're first getting into it and wondering about some of these licenses. So let's talk about the next kind, which is copyleft. Now, what does copyleft refer to here?
Yeah, so it's the opposite of copyright. And I actually don't know if copyleft is a, I don't know if it's a dig on the licenses themselves.
Man, I can't believe I never knew that.
Yeah. But the whole idea, so the idea with copyright is you're locking down restrictions and preventing what people can do with your stuff. Copyleft is you're trying to open it up. And one of the main licenses here is the GNU GPL, the GNU public license. And one of the things about it is it says, so if you apply this license to your software, it says if someone makes modification to your software, they must release it under this exact same license. So it technically can be used for commercial use, but if a company decides to use this software to start a company, any changes they make, they also have to release into the public. They can't keep those closed source. And so one of the main benefits here is it makes sure that any changes that are made, any improvements or whatever else, have to be re-released into the world. And there are successful businesses that have been established that like even use this license, but it does prevent some big corporation from coming along and basically just saying, oh, we're going to reuse this and then not share any of the modifications or changes that we make.
Yeah.
But you do have to be careful with these licenses because of that very reason. So I worked at a large enterprise, and every single dependency that we decided to use, our legal team had to look at the license. And because we were a company that had intellectual property and wanted to make sure we could profit off of any changes that we make, any library that was under this license, we were not allowed to use. Basically, we couldn't touch it because by simply even using one of these libraries in our own project, there's potential that we would have to relicense our entire proprietary source code. So that's something to look out for.
When I worked at Ford, same thing. If we wanted to npm install anything, you had to email legal first.
Yeah.
Dear legal, may I please install jQuery? Like it was, so obnoxious, right? Yeah.
Definitely. And the interesting thing there is, though, I mean, I guess I don't have the exact wording here. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so like, don't take me on this. Go read all the licenses yourself. But there is this idea of like linking software as well. And so linking in the world of JavaScript is literally like just doing an import for a library. You're technically linking to that source code. In other languages and runtimes, you might be linking to like a compiled code or something like that. But I do believe there is a clause in GPL that is, if you link, that's the same thing as like using the software itself. Again, I may not be completely right on that, but that is something you have to look out for, and why there are other types of licenses that exist that are copyleft, but also somewhat permissive. And so this leads into one of the licenses I found, which is called the Mozilla Public License. So it's by the Mozilla Foundation. And it is very much inspired by the GNU GPL, but it says you can link to it without applying this license to your own software. And so I believe like the Firefox web browser is under the MPL license. And so if for whatever reason you wanted to use the Firefox code base, but then create some sort of like closed source commercial software, you wouldn't then have to go put the GPL in it. It could be a secondary license. Yeah, those are the main licenses that you're going to come across, especially like if you're at a smaller company or just like working on your own hobby projects. You basically have permissive, meaning you just want to limit your liability but let anybody do anything, or copyleft. I will say the other term that was used when I was working in enterprise, I think it's also like not a positive term, but it was called a viral license. Because like with the GNU GPL, it's viral in that any software that uses it will try to spread that license to it. So yeah, those are the two types: super permissive or super open and sharing And then you have things in the middle as well.
Yeah.
But that kind of leads us into business licenses. So I know that Sentry has created their own license. Can you talk a bit about that, Scott? Like, why would a company want a different license than the ones we've talked about? What's involved there?
Yeah, so this new Sentry license is called the FSL, and it is kind of based off of did you say BUSL? Do people say BUSL? Is that how they? I've never said it out loud. Yeah,
I've never said it out loud. Yeah, the BUSL. I don't know.
So it is kind of like based off of that, but the functional software license is basically here so that way you can build a business on top of your software without having to worry about people just yanking your code and starting their own business on it, but also have some more permissiveness there. In fact, there's a really great, if you want to learn more about this license, because I know they spent so much time putting this together, the FAQ is really good where it talks into harmful free riding. What about GPLv3 is not permissive enough? What about open core? Not permissive enough. So what can you do with the FSL? You can do anything with FSL software except undermine its producer. You can run it for almost all purposes, study it, modify it, and distribute your changes, including proposing improvements back to the producer. After 2 years, it becomes permissive open source software under Apache 2.0 or MIT. So basically, Sentry allows you to run your own version of Sentry's paid product on your own servers if you want to. They let you study the code. They let you look at it. They let you share improvements to it if you want. But you cannot just fork it and create a business off of it. Because I think that's the big concern, right? You're like, I want to have a business, but I also want to share in open source software. I believe in making source public. But at the same time, I don't want just Joe Schmo to take a copy of my code base, throw up a version of it, do a palette swap on it. Next thing you know, undercut us on price or something.
Yeah. And I think one of the key points there is that after 2 years, it becomes permissive open source. And so the whole idea here is it basically forces in any software that applies this license to innovate, right? So basically, and so like Scott was talking about earlier, if you license a piece of software and then you try to change the license that was applied to the software at any given point in time applies to all of the software before it. Right? And then the new license that you applied only applies to the changes. So what we're saying here is that after 2 years have elapsed, that old source code, basically the commit from 2 years ago, technically is now open source under Apache 2.0 or MIT, and you technically could start a business using that older version of the software. But that now forces Sentry and the company based on the software to innovate and make sure that in the past 2 years, we have added new features and new things that people would want to use that basically give us a business advantage and would make sense for us to keep running this as a business. So it's a pretty interesting concept there. And I believe so this is getting into territory I don't know as much about, but I believe the business source license or the BUSL, it has a similar clause, the BUSL. I think its clause is like something like 4 years, or maybe there's another license that's similar to this, but they say 4 years. But I think one of the reasons that the functional software license was created was to kind of like shorten that timeline and make it so that if you're using this license, you really do have to innovate.
So with we'll have links to some of this stuff, but companies using BUSL are HashiCorp, Redis. Although Redis, they just started using this license, correct? This is a brand new jump because they were straight up open source. This is March 2024, so they recently moved to one of these more lockdown licenses, which kind of freaked a lot of people out. Actually, that Definitely. Was like a whole thing.
And that was like one of the reasons they did it is because people were basically profiting off of their software. Like people had services where you could pay them to host your Redis database, and Redis basically wanted to make sure that they could profit off of that. Now, I mean, you could get into the ethics and business of like, should they be doing this? But as a business trying to make money, that's one thing they wanted to do is if you're a business that's going to be hosting Redis software, and you're going to be charging your users, they want you to potentially pay a licensing fee back to Redis because you are technically using their software. So that's why they started doing this They still do use some open licenses. One of the ones I came across was the server-side public license, which actually originated at MongoDB. But I believe this is like a forked version of the GPL. So we talked about the GNU GPL earlier. It's like a forked version of that has a few differences. And so one of the major reasons that the SSLP, the SSPL, the server-side public license was created was to kind of like close some gaps in the GNU GPL license. And so under the GNU GPL, I have a Stack Exchange answer pulled up here. But it's legal to create a proprietary program B that uses a GPL license program over a local network. So basically, if it's using the program over a network, so like a MongoDB or like a Redis, technically it was legal to do that and keep it proprietary, even with the GNU public license.
Interesting.
Another thing in GNU public license is it's legal that program B provides a service to an end user over the network. And so this gets into one of the main reasons Redis adopted this is anyone wanting to host Redis would be able to do that without having to pay any licensing fees or anything like that. And then the last one here is it's legal to modify program A without sharing changes since A is connected to the network and the end user is provided with the service under a different network. So like there's some weird wording in there that basically makes it so that you could create proprietary versions in certain scenarios. And so the SSPL basically closes up those gaps and makes it so that any changes or anything else completely have to be open source and it doesn't have that proprietary loophole there.
Yeah. You know what? Even just going back to the Redis stuff, by the way, I don't know if I really got the anger towards Redis because before Redis went under a new business license, I had almost never considered if I was going to pay for, usually I host my own Redis, but if I was going to pay for a Redis, which we actually kind of do with Upstash here at Syntax, I would have not gone to Redis's website because I just did not know that they had a paid service. I'm going to be entirely honest. I've been using Redis for so long, and I had no clue they had their own paid service. So for me, it's like, oh yeah, they wrote their software. It's not like it's an outrageous amount of money. I'm going to typically host mine myself anyways, but yeah, I mean, I get how people could be upset by it. Maybe you built a business off of it, but end users, man, it's really not that hard to host your own. If you got your own server set up somewhere, it's pretty trivial to spin up a Redis instance.
Definitely. And so, yeah, those are the types of licenses. I think one of the last things we'll talk about here is choosing license and then also like acknowledging licenses. So if you use software that is under the MIT license, technically the MIT license states that you have to include this license in your own software whenever you re-release it. Yeah, so it says the above copyright notice and this permission notice shall be included in all copies or substantial portions of the software. And so you may be wondering, all right, I'm using a library that's MIT. What does that mean? A really good example of this is Discord. So if you go to discord.com/licenses, they have every single dependency listed here that they use like in the Discord mobile app or the Discord desktop app and the associated licenses. So things like Babel are listed here. There's just a whole bunch of like Babel dependencies, and they literally have the MIT license from Sebastian McKenzie listed on this page here. And then, there's some other Babel licenses, and then we get into like AWS libraries and stuff like that. These are under the Apache license, and so you see that listed here. And so this is like a really good example in the wild of you have some software that people are using, but you should, according to those licenses, you should have a page that lists the software, the dependencies that you use and the licenses that are applied to them.
Wild. Yeah. And if you want to choose a license for yourself, like CJ had mentioned earlier in this episode, choosealicense.com, really great resource. And if it feels even overwhelming to look at, like, I don't really know what I want to do, and I just want to know how they're all different, the /licenses page on this site really gives you a nice overview of the different types of licenses with that red light, green light, blue light kind of deal. It shows you basically what's permissive about them and what's locked down. And a really kind of just quickly swipe up and down, you're going to be able to see what's going on. So it should be pretty easy to get an idea of what you want your software to do. And you should probably know that before trying to choose a license. You got to sit down and think, what do I actually want people to do with my software? What is this going to be? Is this going to be a business eventually? Is this going to be a community project? Is this just goofing off and whatever? So you have a good idea of what you're trying to do first and foremost.
Yep. And then once you've chosen a license, you need to add it to your app. And one of the things that I really like to use for this is a package called license. It's on npm. You can do an npm install -g. And then in any directory, you just say license space and then the name of the license.
Mm-hmm.
And it will generate that license file in that directory and like put your name on it. So I use this for all my projects. Like Scott mentioned earlier, when you're creating a new repo on GitHub, you can technically just choose MIT and it'll generate that for you. And then the other thing is, if you're in the world of Node.js and JavaScript, your package.json has a license field there. And so you would want to list the name of the license that you're using there as well.
Cool. Well, that's it for open source. We should do even more on this. We should maybe have somebody from Sentry's open source team on it to really get into some nitty gritty. But I think this was a really great introduction for anybody who, well, sees the licenses and starts to freak out that it's something legal going on here. That's kind of been me for a while. So I really appreciate this time to pick this up and share these resources. And let us know what kind of software you have. What type of license are you using? Is it something different than what we talked about? Is there anything interesting going on with your software licensing that we did not cover in this episode? Leave a comment on our YouTube. We're at youtube.com/@syntaxfm. We want to hear from you. That's all I got today. Anything else, CJ?
That's all I got. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Sick. Peace.
Peace.